This week has been one of the most wild weeks of ministry that I've had in about 7 or so years, and it turned out that if really we got to see the church at its very best, and that's really an amazing thing. And as you know, many of you know, maybe some of you don't. On Wednesday evening, we had one of our youth go missing from the church. And what ensued was about 24 hours of panic, about 24 hours of searching, about 24 hours of praying, and it was quite remarkable when all was said and done. We had several dozen people from our congregation, really close to 100 people from our congregation, really rally and pass out thousands of flyers, and spent countless hours searching and praying. And as you know, we were having a prayer service on Thursday night, and about 4 minutes before the prayer service, he was found. And so that's an amazing thing. But I was really proud of our congregation, and you should be proud of our congregation, that whenever something happens, people step up, that our congregation is a caring congregation, that our congregation loves each other. And that's how you love each other, is by being there for each other when we need each other the most. My favorite part of the time was about 3 a.m. on Wednesday night when Joe Green, myself, Nathan Flora, and the principal for Ross and Robertson were all just driving around and having a blast. You can imagine what Joe Green acts like when he's going on about 2 hours of sleep and is dead tired, and it's 3 a.m. and you're driving around with Joe Green. So we should have done some filming about that. That would have been really fun. And so he would have probably sounded a lot like Cahill during that time. So last week, Amanda began talking to you about our series, which is Back to the Basics. And pretty much what she said is that when you sum it up, the Christian life can be accomplished. The Christian life really consists of two main things. And Jesus calls these the Great Commandments. He says that the first is to love God with everything. To love Him with all of your strength, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, with all of your passions, with all of your heart. And then the other is like it, and it's to love your neighbor as yourself. So if you had to sum up what the Christian walk is all about, it's about loving God and loving others. And what she sort of mentioned was that a lot of times we really complicate this, that we really make following Christ, we really make being a Christian something that's very complicated. And so how do we go back to the basics? How do we step back? How do we observe? And how do we recalibrate ourselves so that we can truly follow God as we ought to be following God? And so last week she spoke to you specifically about what it looks like to love God. And what I would argue is that loving God and loving others are two sides of the same coin, that they have to go hand in hand, and you have to do one to be able to fully do the other one well. That in order to love others as well as you possibly can, you really have to be able to love God. But in order to love God, you can't love God without really loving others. Two sides of the same coin. And so today I want to specifically talk about what it looks like to love others. How do we really love others? And so to do that, I want to ask a question. Have you ever thought about this word? Have you ever really thought about it? Have you ever thought about what that word really means? Because when you think about it, that word means a whole lot, doesn't it? That word carries a lot of connotations with it, many of them being positive, but as you know, many of them are negative as well. In fact, if you think about it hard enough, this word can probably mean about whatever you want it to mean. There have been people on both sides of every issue that's ever faced us, at least over the past 2,000 years, that have been Christian. There have been people on both sides of just about every war that's been Christian. There have been people on both sides of every political argument that have been Christian, of every legal argument that have been Christians. You even have family members that are Christians, but you can't stand them, right? You know what's interesting about the word Christian is it's actually a term that began being used in the first century, and it was a derogatory term. It was a term used by non-Christians, by people who didn't follow Jesus, to refer to the people who did follow Jesus. And so only non-Christians really use the word. And consequently, the word Christian itself only ends up in the Bible 3 times. And each of those 3 times is sort of in a negative connotation. And it doesn't really give us a definition of what Christian actually means. But we know that the people that were part of the church, when they would refer to themselves, they wouldn't refer to themselves as Christians. What would they refer to themselves as? Followers, disciples is how they would talk about themselves. That when you read in the Gospels, whenever in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, whenever they're talking about themselves, they would call themselves disciples. And what's funny about the word disciple is that it's sort of terrifying because it's very clearly defined. The word Christian isn't very clearly defined at all. In fact, today it's not very clearly defined, but the word disciple is very clearly defined. The fact is, you can be a Christian and you can really believe just about anything. You can be a Christian and you can adopt just about any type of lifestyle, but you can't do that when you're a disciple. If anybody challenges you and you call yourself a Christian, you're to say, whoa, wait just a second. I'm a Christian. And you can begin to spit out things that you believe that might make you a Christian. But see, the difference between a Christian and a disciple is simply this, that a Christian is really all about what a person believes. That being a Christian means that you believe certain things, right? That Jesus rose from the dead, that Jesus is the only Son of God, that Jesus was fully human yet fully God at the same time. These are all these doctrines that we hold to. But a disciple is different. A disciple is all about what a person does. Right, when you look back at the calling of the disciples, when Jesus called the disciples, they didn't know anything. Jesus didn't make them agree to certain facts. He didn't make them agree to certain doctrines before they could follow him. What a disciple did was they just left everything behind and they just followed Jesus. So the difference is that a Christian's all about what a person believes and a disciple is all about what a person actually does. And if you consider yourself a Christian, if you're a church person, which I would say the majority of us in here are, you need to understand that people who are not followers of Jesus look at us and sometimes they expect more of us than we even expect of ourselves. And they see this gap that begins to exist. And so there's this tension. There's this conflict. And Gandhi said it like this: I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ that there's a higher expectation that these non-Christians have of us than we have of ourselves. Steve Jobs, in his autobiography, said it this way. Steve Jobs was not a Christian, and he said this: the juice goes out of Christianity when it becomes too based on faith rather than on living like Jesus or seeing the world as Jesus saw it. Now, we really shouldn't be surprised by this, because when we go back to the New Testament, we see that Jesus was asked the question, what does it look like to be your follower? What does it look like to be a disciple? And Jesus gives the answer pretty succinctly when he talks about it in John chapter 13. He says this: by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. If you love one another. It's not by what you believe. That's not how people know you're a Christian. Isn't that funny? It's not about where you worship. It's not about where you go to church. It's not about what you spend your time doing on Sunday mornings. But the defining characteristic of a person who is a follower of Jesus is how they love other people. Isn't that funny? Because I've been taught my entire life that that's not what makes a Christian. That what makes a Christian is me saying a prayer. What makes a Christian is me believing this or believing that. But Jesus says, no, that's not what makes you my follower. What matters more than anything is how you love others. We can see this streamed throughout the entire Gospels. And in Matthew chapter 28, many of you are familiar with what's known as the Great Commission. He gives this charge: therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And as you know, these disciples did that. right? They did that pretty well, and they began to develop and spread out, and they developed these little ecclesias, is what we call them, these little Jesus communities where people shared everything, where everybody took care of everyone else, and they began to teach in such a way that people were drawn to them, and people wanted what they had. People wanted to know what they knew. People wanted what they had in their life because they were missing something in their life. And it went great for about 300 years or so. And as some of you know, at the beginning of the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine became a Christian. He became a Christian because he thought Jesus helped him win a battle. And he converted the Roman Empire, where Christianity was once illegal. It became legal, and it just didn't become legal. It became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And something happened when that happened. That things went bad. Because now the church had the power. Now listen to this, because I think it's really, really important. That anytime the church or anytime Christians leverage anything other than love. Let me say that again. Anytime the church leverages anything other than love. I'll say it just one more time so you get it. Anytime the church leverages anything other than love, we go backwards rather than forwards. Because Jesus said, by this one thing, people will know that you are my followers, that you love one another. And so once the church got power, they decided that they're not going to leverage love anymore. They're going to leverage their control. They're going to leverage their political power. They're going to leverage all of these other things to force people to become Christians, and things went backwards. And so after the church got to be in control, the Great Commission went from looking like one thing to looking like this. Therefore, go and impose my teachings, my values, and worldview on all nations, threatening them with judgment and destruction if they don't obey everything I've commanded you. And that's what happened. You became a Christian by the tip of the sword. And what's funny is that today, it almost still happens like that. We just passed Halloween, and you know that several churches do these things called judgment houses. Has anybody heard of those? Man, it's what all my friends did when I was growing up. And what was crazy about it, judgment houses are events that certain churches put on. There's a few churches that put them on in our area. And what you do is you go into this judgment house. It's sort of like a play, sort of like there might be stations with it. And you sort of see someone die and go to hell. And you sort of see this person go through judgment. And what it's meant to do, whether people admit to this or not, what it's meant to do is scare the hell out of you. Right? So that you decide that, I need to get to heaven. What's funny about that is when I was growing up, and so many of my friends did this, in Hawkins County we don't have much to do, and so they're like, let's do something at a judgment house. All right, let's go. What's funny about it is that in the very same breath that these people would tell me that I went to this judgment house, and gosh, it was so awesome. I accepted Jesus, and I said this prayer, and but in the same breath, they'd start telling me how they were sleeping with their girlfriend. That it didn't change their behavior. It didn't change what they actually did. It may have changed their beliefs, but it didn't change who they were. They'd become a Christian, but they hadn't become a disciple. Somewhere the church has gotten this wrong, because somewhere we started leveraging stuff other than love. And it's by love that people know that we are his disciples. And when we leverage anything other than love, we go backwards instead of forwards every single time. So let me tell you what's happened for us here in North America and in Western Europe, because we've gotten this idea wrong, because we've messed this up, because we've used other stuff other than love to leverage ourselves. We have unnecessarily put ourselves at odds with culture. Friends, we have the greatest news in the world. If your finances are bad, we have an answer. His name's Jesus. Put Jesus in the middle of your finances, things are going to get better. If your marriage is bad, we have an answer. His name's Jesus. Put Jesus at the middle of your marriage, and things are going to get better. for everything that's wrong in your life, for everything that you're struggling with, when you put Jesus in the middle of it, things will get better. That's good news. That's the gospel. But yet somehow we've gotten really poor at communicating that. Somehow the church has really struggled with how we communicate that effectively. And the reason is we don't really know how to properly interact with non-Christians, and truthfully, we don't really even know how to interact with each other. And when people see that, they hold us at a higher standard than we hold ourselves, and the gap causes people to question us. The good news is that Paul dealt with this very same thing. And so he wrote some letters to the church in Corinth, and Corinth was like the Las Vegas of the Roman Empire. What happened in Corinth stayed in Corinth, right? And so he wrote 4 letters to the Corinthians. We only have 2 of them now. But in those, he addresses a lot of things that are going on. And what's so interesting is that when you study the history of Corinth, it's quite similar to the United States right now and how we exist. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul writes this: I wrote to you in my letter, he's referring to a letter that we don't have, not to associate with sexually immoral people. So you're like, yeah, that makes sense. But then he goes on to say this: not at all meaning the people of this world. Not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy, or the swindlers, or the idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. Have anybody read that verse before? Right, so it makes sense. Don't associate with the sexually immoral. But I'm not really talking about the people of this world. I'm not talking about non-Christians. You need to associate with the sexually immoral. You need to associate with the idolaters. You need to associate with the swindlers and the greedy. That's helpful because some of you go to family reunions and you say, I'm not even sure I should be around these people. Right? Or you go to work parties and you say, gosh, I used to do that stuff, but I'm a Christian now. I don't do that stuff anymore. And you feel really uncomfortable being there with them. And the Apostle Paul says, yes, you are not supposed to divorce yourself from those people. You're not supposed to push away from those people. So the first thing we need to do is we need to learn that we are not supposed to disengage from others because they have actions or beliefs that we don't agree with. That's huge because I know for me, the majority of my friends are Christians. The majority of the people that I interact with every day, and pastors are the absolute worst at this, and Lucas can agree with this, that everybody we come in contact with is a Christian. But now for some of you, that's not the case. But yet there's this tension that exists where you want to just spend all your time with maybe just the Christians, maybe just the people that are just like you. Paul goes on to write this that I think is really important. And right after that, in verse 11 of chapter 5, he says, but now I am writing you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater, a slanderer, a drunkard, or a swindler. Do not even eat with such people. So he says everybody that's a drunkard, everybody that's a swindler, everybody that's immoral, that isn't a Christian, you need to be in their life. But if the people that claim to be Christians, but they don't hold themselves to a high standard, you don't need to associate with those people at all. It's interesting. So he's saying, let's make sure that you've got this. You're supposed to, really, he's saying, you're supposed to judge the people on the inside, but you're not supposed to judge the people on the outside at all. He goes on to write this question: what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? The answer is, it's none of his business. It's none of my business. It's none of your business. But it is our business for those that are on the inside of the church to hold them to a high standard, hold ourselves to a high standard. And do you want to know why a lot of people don't go to church, especially my generation, millennials? But I think it's true throughout every age group right now. I think a lot of people don't go to church because they've been judged by Christians based on a lifestyle that they never signed up to follow in the first place. Right? That Christians are notorious for policing people that aren't part of who they are, that don't believe exactly what they believe, that haven't signed up for the lifestyle that we want them to sign up for. And so we judge them based on that. But yet the people that are on the outside of that says, I never signed up to do that. I never signed up to be moral. I never signed up to not cheat on my spouse. I never signed up to deal with my money how Christians should deal with my money. But yet I'm being judged for that, but I never signed up for it. He wraps it up by saying this: are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. I bet you some of you didn't know that was in the Bible, did you? Because we always hear, don't judge or you be judged. We hear it all the time. Don't judge me. The Bible says not to judge anybody. That's false. We're not to judge those outside the church. Right here, you can write it down if you want to go check it up later. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 12. Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. So remember this. Do not expect non-Jesus followers to behave like Jesus followers. Don't expect it. But remember this. Do expect Jesus followers to behave like Jesus followers. We get this backwards because we're so notorious for telling non-Jesus followers that they need to behave like Jesus followers. But yet, inside the church, we don't. It's funny. If you've ever been a kid, which is all of us, you understand this, because in the household that you grew up in, or at least in the household that I grew up in, we had rules. And if I broke one of those rules, guess who would show up? The judge, right? Mom or dad would show up and they would say, we have rules in this household. And you broke those rules, and so now there's consequences. And if they wouldn't have done that, I wouldn't be the person I am today. If they would have said, we have rules, but no big deal, we'll turn a blind eye. If they would have done that over and over and over, that would have ruined me. And I know kids in our own congregation that are allowed to do whatever they want to do. And it's dangerous. And it's a poor reflection on the parents. Because if your household doesn't have rules, you don't have a very good household. If you as a parent never act as a judge for your children, you're not a very good parent. And that's all really Paul's talking about. That once you become part of the church, that once you join the Jesus followers, there are rules, there are standards. And we've been called to hold each other accountable to those standards. But we're not called to hold other people accountable. For example, if your kids, Paul, if Ron's not doing his homework, I don't really care if Ron's not doing his homework. But you should care, right? Paul should sit down with Ron and say, Ron, listen up. You can play drums all day long, but you got to get your homework done, right? That it's his job to rule his household. It's his job to make sure his kids are doing what they need to do so that they can place themselves in a position to be successful once they get older. The church is the same way. So our responsibility is simply this: love one another and don't judge the outsider. But loving one another includes helping each other. Now, can you imagine where we would be if we never abandoned that? Can you imagine, instead of trying to coerce all these people into the faith, if we decided to win people to the faith? If we decided to live in such a way that people saw us and they said, I want what they have. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get what they have. Imagine if in the church we held each other accountable. if Christians didn't divorce at the same rate that non-Christians divorce at. Imagine. Imagine if as Christians we could just divorce maybe at 10% instead of at 55%. Imagine how the world would look at us. Imagine if we all raised our kids to follow Jesus completely. And imagine if we fully modeled that for them. What it looks like to be a Jesus follower. Not what it looks like to go to church, but what it looks like to really follow Jesus. Can you imagine if we held each other accountable and all of Christians became generous? Can you imagine what would happen? I can let you know real quick what could happen, because I shared this with the Center Campus because it's changed my world over the past month or so. We were talking about money a few weeks ago, and there was some research done on tithing and on Christians just in the United States, and Relevant Magazine put this out, and they said this: the church of today is not great at giving. This isn't exactly news, but it's a statistical fact. Tithers make up only 10 to 25% of a normal congregation. Only 5% of the United States tithes, with 80% of Americans giving only 2% of their income. Christians are only giving at 2.5% per capita, while during the Great Depression, they gave at a rate of 3.3%. So the average Christian gives away 2.5%. And they took the average median household income and they said, what if that 2.5 went up to 10%? And they said, this is what could happen if every Christian, just in the United States, gave 10% of their income to the church. That the church would have an additional $165 billion to use. And that the global impact with $165 billion would be phenomenal. And they write, here's just a few things that the church could do with that kind of money. $25 billion could relieve global hunger, starvation, and deaths from preventable diseases in 5 years. $12 billion could eliminate illiteracy in 5 years. $15 billion could solve the world's water and sanitation issues, specifically at places in the world where 1 billion people live on less than $1 a day. $1 billion could fully fund all overseas mission work. Have you ever heard people criticize God because of all these bad things that happen in the world? I know a lot of people that choose to not believe in God because how could a loving God allow 30,000 children to die from preventable diseases every single day? And yet when I read this, I think, well, that's not God's fault. God actually has placed the church in a position to be able to cure it. It's our fault. Because somewhere down the line, we stopped leveraging love. And we started leveraging something else. Can you imagine what the world would look like if we held each other accountable? If we really loved each other how Jesus tells us to love each other? If instead of pointing the finger at people that aren't part of us, we joined in with them, we got to know them, and we got to show them what we have that they don't. And they became thirsty for it. So let's just us. Even if no one else gets it right. Let's just us decide today that we're going to begin to hold each other accountable. A lot of you have friends in here that are your friends with outside of here. Those are the people that you need to make sure life's going well with, and they need to make sure your life's going well. Lucas and I are in a small group together, and we meet every single week. And in fact, Dave and Liz, who are in the back, are part of that small group. They need to hold me accountable. They need to have conversations with me about giving money away. They need to have conversations with me about, am I treating my wife how she ought to be treated? I need those conversations in my life. And whether or not you think you need them, you need those conversations in your life. Because together we can truly be the church. Together we can truly make Christian a word that's not just tossed around, but a word that really changes lives. That when we love God fully and when we love each other fully, it's challenging, but it changes things. It changes people. It changes us. Let's pledge today that we're going to start living like that, because if we get it right, if we get this right, it changes everything. That truly the kingdom of heaven would come to earth, and people from all tribes, all nations, all languages would bow at the name of Jesus. But it's our responsibility. God's allowed us to take part in this. God's allowed us to take responsibility with this. And it's time. Because if we keep the status quo, in the next 50 years, organized religion in the United States will be over. This building will still be here, maybe, but it'll be empty. In 50 years, that's it. By the time I retire, it's going to be over. Unless something changes. And God's put us in a place to where we can change it. And it starts with us. It starts with you. It starts with me. When we begin to living the lifestyle that is fully loving God and fully loving each other, those inside the church and those outside the church. Would you pray with me? God, as we come to this time, we just ask that your truth would be revealed to us. That so often we choose to leverage things other than love. And whether we realize it or not, every time we do it, we take a step backwards. God, help us to realize that we're called to hold each other accountable, that we're called to hold each other to the standard that you have given us. But help us realize that when we do that, we begin to live the life that you want us to live. We begin to live life to the fullest. Because God, I know I need accountability. I need people holding me on the path of righteousness. And Father, I know that the people outside the church, they just need to see the love that we have for them, not the judgment. There's enough of that. So God, here at First Broad Street, help us see things differently. Help us see the world differently. Help us see the world through your eyes. And God, help us change the world. That is your goal for us. And God, let's truly make that our goal for ourselves. That we will each be world changers. And that we're going to do it through loving you with everything that we have. And loving our neighbor as ourselves. And Father, all of these prayers we make in the name of Jesus. Amen.